He was never meant to see me again. And yet, there he was, beneath chandeliers that cost more than my entire life. The Valthera Grand Regency Ballroom was packed with people who belonged there. Senators, corporate heads, royals from bloodlines so old they had their own weather patterns. The chandeliers above them burned gold. The floors gleamed like frozen water. The air itself smelled like money and control. And me, 7 months pregnant. No invitation. No business being here. I pressed one hand against the curve of my stomach and kept moving. The rented dress I wore was the nicest thing I owned. Still didn't fit right. The neckline sat a little crooked. The hem grazed the wrong part of my ankle. Every step I took through that crowd felt like a mistake I was choosing to make anyway. But I had made it inside. That was the first thing. The security guard at the east entrance had checked his tablet, frowned, checked it again, and then, just for a second, looked up at me with something that wasn't suspicion, something closer to pity. He waved me through without a word. I didn't ask why. I walked before he could change his mind. The ballroom was enormous in a way that made your chest tighten. Not just large. Designed to make you feel small. Vaulted ceilings. Gold molding. Tables draped in white linen so thick you could fold yourself inside it. Flowers everywhere. Tall, white, architectural, the kind nobody actually likes but everyone agrees to pretend are beautiful. I moved along the far wall. My feet hurt. My back had been aching since that morning. The baby shifted. One slow roll that pushed against my ribs, and I stopped walking for just a second, steadied myself against a service pillar, and breathed. This was a mistake. I knew that coming in. I came anyway, because I needed to see him. Not to confront. Not to demand anything. Just to see. To stand in the same room and remind myself that he was real. That what happened 5 years ago was real. That I wasn't crazy. That I wasn't dramatic. That the thing I had been carrying in my body, in my chest, in every sleepless 3 a.m. I'd survived alone. That it all came from somewhere true. I just needed to see his face. That was the only reason. Hi viewers. Have you ever walked into a room where you knew you didn't belong, but something inside you said go anyway? Tell me in the comments, what was it and did you regret it? The applause started before I even located the source. A set of double doors at the north end of the ballroom opened. The crowd shifted. Glasses lifted. Heads turned. And the energy in that room changed the way energy only changes when power enters a space. 3 men walked in. Identical in height. Identical in the cut of their jaw. Dressed in different shades of the same deep charcoal. One near black, one dark gray, one the color of slate in rain. They moved like they had been trained for exactly this. Measured. Deliberate. Like every step had already been decided. The Virex triplets. Draxon on the left, jaw forward, scanning the room the way security personnel scan a room. Kaler on the right, expression unreadable, almost bored. And Soren in the center. Soren. My chest locked. I hadn't prepared for how it would actually feel. The sight of him in the flesh after 5 years wasn't like a memory surfacing. It was heavier than that. More physical. Like something I had packed away very carefully, in a very dark place, had just burst its own container. He was taller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just spent 5 years shrinking him down in my mind so the grief would be manageable. His hair was shorter now. His shoulders had filled out in the way that happens when pressure gets heavy enough and long enough that it just becomes posture. There was no expression on his face. Just presence. The kind of presence that fills a room whether it wants to or not. The crowd welcomed them with deference. I stood still against the wall. And then Soren's eyes moved across the room. Not searching. Just settling. The way your eyes move when you've walked into a place so many times that you stop seeing it. Until something out of place catches you without warning. His gaze landed on me. 1 second. Maybe 2. Nothing happened in his face. Nothing. He looked away. That was it. That was the moment I had risked everything for. A 2-second glance from a man who looked right through me like I was part of the wallpaper. He didn't recognize me. My stomach dropped. I pressed my hand tighter against my belly. The baby shifted again. And I stood there in my crooked neckline and my wrong-length hem, invisible in a room full of gold light, trying to figure out how to leave with whatever was left of my composure. But my feet wouldn't move, because something had happened in those 2 seconds that I couldn't explain yet. Something in the way Soren's gaze had traveled away, not fully. There was a fraction of a pause before he looked away, so small that anyone else in that room would have missed it entirely. I didn't miss it. I had spent 5 years reading everything he never said. I knew what that pause meant. Not recognition. Not yet. But the beginning of it. Like a word on the tip of your tongue that hasn't surfaced yet, but your body already knows it's coming. I stayed. I moved toward the nearest open table. My heart was doing something that had no clean description. And when I reached the table, occupied partially by a small cluster of guests who didn't look at me once, I did the only thing left to do. I pulled out a chair. I sat. And the man directly to my right, dark jacket, sharp profile, a glass of something amber in one hand, turned slowly. Soren Selim Virex looked at me, close, and something in his face, not recognition. Not exactly, but something that looked like the moment right before recognition, like a fracture forming before the break. "Can I sit with you?" I whispered. The words had already left me before I realized I had said them. And for 3 full seconds, Soren Virex said absolutely nothing. His eyes dropped, just once, to my stomach, then back up to my face. The coastal summit smelled like salt and ambition. That's the first thing that hit you when you stepped off the transport. Not the ocean breeze. Not the cypress trees lining the private walkway. Ambition. It was in the posture of every person moving across those grounds. In the way conversations stopped and restarted whenever someone new entered a space. In the quiet, controlled way that people who had never needed anything in their lives still managed to seem like they were competing for something. Arden had worked 3 of these summits before that one. Check-in logistics, shuttle coordination, managing the behind-the-scenes machinery that made powerful people feel effortless. He was good at it. He was invisible at it, which was the point. You didn't want event staff to be seen. You wanted the experience to feel like it had assembled itself. The Selim Coastal Leadership Summit ran across 4 days, 47 attendees, 8 keynote sessions, 2 private dinners, and 1 balcony on the west wing of the main estate that faced the water and had no assigned function. It wasn't on any itinerary. That was the only reason Arden went there. He had slipped out after the first dinner wrapped. His earpiece was off. His clipboard was tucked under one arm. He needed 20 minutes where nothing needed him. He got 8. Because 8 minutes in, the balcony door opened behind him. He turned expecting maintenance, or a lost guest, or someone who had been sent to find him about a linen shortage in conference room C, which had been a recurring issue since day 1. He got Soren Virex. No entourage, no jacket, the top button of his dress shirt undone, sleeves pushed to his forearms. He looked like a man who had been sitting in a room full of people and had finally run out of the thing that lets you keep doing that. He stopped when he saw Arden. A half-second pause. "I can go," Arden said immediately. "Don't." Soren said it fast. Not demanding, just fast. Like he needed it to land before the politeness could take over. He moved to the railing, stood about 3 feet away, looked out at the water. Arden stood still. Neither of them spoke for about 2 minutes. That was the first unusual thing about Soren Virex. He wasn't uncomfortable in silence. Most people, especially people with his kind of position, felt silence as pressure. They rushed to fill it with something. Status. Commentary. The subtle performance of being interesting. Soren just stood there and breathed and watched the water like that was enough. "You work the logistics?" he asked eventually. Not a guess. Just confirmation. "Yes," Arden said. "The shuttle this morning was 40 seconds early." Arden blinked. "I know. The driver miscounted the pickup window. I fixed it for tomorrow." Soren turned his head slightly. You noticed it too. I notice everything that goes wrong. That must be exhausting. Arden didn't answer right away, because it was. It genuinely was. But not in the way that needed sympathy. In the way that was just true. He noticed. He fixed. He moved on. You're the one who added the accessibility ramp on the east entrance this morning, Soren said. That landed somewhere unexpected. One of the keynote guests uses a cane, Arden said. It wasn't in the original floor plan. The venue didn't do that. No, you did. Arden looked at him. Soren was already looking back. There was nothing performative in it. No maneuvering. Just a man who had apparently been paying attention in a room full of things designed to pull his attention everywhere else. That was the second unusual thing about Soren Virex. He noticed things he wasn't required to notice. They stayed on that balcony for 40 more minutes. They talked the way people talk when there's no audience and nothing to prove. Soren talked about the weight of being one of 3 identical faces attached to an institution. How every room he walked into had already decided who he was before he opened his mouth. How being part of a triplet dynamic meant you were never fully seen as individual, you were always a fraction of a unit. A representative. A symbol. Do you ever want to just be wrong about something? Arden asked at some point. Soren looked at him. What do you mean? Like just make a bad call. Not because you had bad information. Just because you wanted to choose something and it turned out to be wrong. And that's it. Nothing collapses. Nothing gets reported. It's just wrong and you survive it. Soren was quiet for a moment. Every day, he said. That was how the rest of it started. Not with attraction first. With recognition. The specific kind of recognition that happens when 2 people figure out they are carrying a version of the same weight. They met on that balcony 2 more times over the following days. On the 3rd night, the conversation ran past midnight. The water had gone dark. The estate had gone quiet. And somewhere between the last sentence and the silence that followed it, the space between them closed. One night, that was all it was. One night that felt like proof that something real could happen between 2 people who had no business being in the same room. Arden left before the sun was up. He didn't leave a note. He didn't send a message. He told himself it was clean. That he was being smart. That someone like Soren Virex couldn't afford the complications and someone like Arden couldn't afford the heartbreak. And leaving early was the kindest version of both. He told himself he was protecting him. He believed that for a long time. What he didn't know. What he had no way of knowing. Standing in that pre-dawn dark with his shoes in his hand and his heart already doing something it shouldn't. Was that they hadn't been alone on that balcony. Not all 3 nights. Someone had been watching. The first sign was small enough to explain away. Arden's next contract with the summit coordination firm, the one that came through every autumn, didn't come through. He waited. He followed up. He got a form email telling him the client list had been restructured. No details. No callback. He found new work. Smaller events. Local stuff. Paid less, but it was steady. Then the steady work stopped being steady. A venue coordinator he'd worked with for 2 years stopped returning calls. Not rudely, the calls just never connected. He'd reach voicemail, leave a message, wait. Nothing. He assumed she was busy. He assumed a lot of things. Then his apartment lease didn't renew. His landlord, a quiet man named Mr. Owens who had never once been difficult in 4 years, sat across from him at the kitchen table and couldn't look him in the eye. I have to be honest with you, Mr. Owens said. Someone reached out. Someone from a management company I've never dealt with. They made me an offer to terminate early and take the unit off the rental market. A very good offer. He paused. I asked who sent them. They said it was a private client. Arden sat very still. I told them no, Mr. Owens said quietly. 3 times. They came back a 4th time with a number I couldn't refuse. I'm sorry, son. Arden went home that night and sat on his kitchen floor. He didn't cry. He wasn't there yet. He was still in the part where the pieces are laying around you and your brain is doing the work of deciding whether or not to put them together. He put them together. lost contract, blocked contacts, terminated lease, a management company with a private client. This wasn't bad luck. This was a sequence. 2 weeks later, a friend, a woman named Tamsin who worked in a government licensing office and owed him a favor he'd never called in, ran a quiet search for him. Not official. Just eyes on a database she had access to. His name had a flag. Not a criminal flag. Not a legal flag. Something more administrative than that. A notation. A quiet hold that sat in the background of background checks and licensing applications and vendor approval systems. It didn't say why. It didn't have to. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it edits you out. He found out about the pregnancy 3 weeks after that. He sat in a pharmacy bathroom for 20 minutes after reading the test. Then he put it in his pocket and walked home in the rain and sat with it alone in a way that had no name. He thought about telling someone. He thought about a lot of things. He thought about the balcony and the dark water and the way Soren had looked at him like he was the first real thing he had encountered in a very long time. He thought about what it meant that all of this had started happening right after that night. He thought about the word that kept surfacing when he tried to make sense of it. Erased. Not heartbroken. Not abandoned. Erased. There is a difference. Heartbreak is something one person does to another. It is personal and it is painful and it ends. Erasure is something a system does. It is impersonal and it is methodical and it does not end because it was never personal in the first place. He had been identified as a risk. Not to Soren. To the machinery around Soren. The advisors and the political architecture and the dynastic reputation that required everyone near it to be either useful or absent. Arden had been useful for 4 days at a summit. After that, he was something else. Someone paid his landlord to terminate his lease. Someone flagged his name in an administrative database. Someone built a quiet wall between him and every professional contact he had. And none of it was illegal. That was the part that kept him up at night. None of it broke a single law. It was just power doing what power does when it feels something it didn't plan for. It moved. He moved too. He relocated. Found a sublet in a neighborhood where he didn't know anyone and no one knew him. He waitlisted for prenatal care at a community clinic and paid out of pocket when the waitlist stalled. He took whatever work came through. Data entry, scheduling, anything that didn't require a vendor license. He survived it. Month by month. He survived it. And he told himself he was done with it. That the story had ended. That he would raise this child and he would never set foot in any room that had anything to do with the Virex name. He held that conviction for 4 years and 11 months. Then he heard about the gala. Heard that it was open to registered event professionals for the first hour, a press and vendor preview, before the private evening began. He still had one credential that hadn't been flagged. A small catering association membership he'd paid into for years without using. It was enough to get him through one door. He didn't plan to cause anything. He just needed to see. He needed to stand in the same room one time and look at the face of the man who didn't know what had been done in his name. Or did know. He wasn't sure which possibility frightened him more. But what he hadn't planned for, what no part of his careful, survival-trained mind had thought through, was that Soren would be standing 3 feet away from him at a table with an empty seat. And that the words would come out before he could stop them. He wasn't running from heartbreak anymore. He had been running from machinery. And now the machinery and the man were in the same room. And so was he. Soren said nothing for a long time. Not the social kind of nothing. Not the pause that precedes a polite response. This was something else. Something that looked like a man whose body had registered information his mind hadn't caught up to yet. His eyes held Arden's. Then they moved, just briefly, to the stomach. One look. Not rude. Not dramatic. Just a look that meant he had accounted for it. Then back up. Sit, he said. One word. Lo. Not a command. Not quite an invitation. Something in between, the kind of word you use when you're making space for something you don't fully understand yet but you're not going to push away. Arden sat. The table around them had 3 other occupants. A pair of older men deep in a conversation about port developments, and a woman in a green gown who was scrolling something on a small device under the tablecloth and clearly had no interest in anyone near her. Nobody looked. But across the room, that was a different situation. Draxon had been tracking the room since the moment they entered. That was how he functioned, continuous, quiet assessment. He noticed the seating change at Soren's table inside of 40 seconds. He didn't move. But he watched. Kaler, standing 3 bodies to the left near the cocktail display, caught the shift later. He went still the way Kaler always went still when something registered, not visibly tense, just suddenly contained. Like a machine that just got new input and is deciding what to do with it. The ballroom continued around all of them. Music from a string quartet near the east wall. The chime of glasses. A burst of laughter from a cluster of guests near the entrance stairs. Soren placed his own glass on the table. His hands rested flat. "I don't remember seeing you on the evening list," he said. Not accusatory. Measured. Testing the edge of something. "I was on the vendor preview," Arden said. "I know my time window is gone." "Yes. I'm not here to cause anything." Soren looked at him with an expression that was very hard to read. Not cold. Not warm. Careful was the word. Like a man walking terrain he doesn't have a map for. "What's your name?" he asked. That hit harder than it should have. Arden held still. He kept his voice level. "Arden," he said. Something moved through Soren's face. Not recognition. Not yet. But the absence of non-recognition. The face of a man who has heard a word he can't place but knows he's heard before. Somewhere. A long time ago. In some context that doesn't surface cleanly. Across the room, something shifted. A group near the north side of the ballroom had grown louder. Not music louder. People louder. A cluster around a large man in a wine-red suit. Broad-shouldered, heavy-ringed fingers, the kind of presence that makes everyone near it either lean in or lean away. His name was Brecken Torval. Arden had heard it before. A rival political figure. Old money with new grievances. He came to events like this not to celebrate anything but to be seen not celebrating. He was already looking in their direction. Not at Arden specifically. At the table, the Soren, at the particular arrangement of a Virex heir seated beside someone who was very visibly, very obviously, very heavily pregnant. In a room where that combination would generate precisely the kind of whisper that men like Brecken Torval collected and repurposed. Someone near him leaned in and said something. Torval smiled. Not at a joke. The way a man smiles when he has just been handed something useful. Arden felt the back of his neck go tight. He started to shift his chair back. Soren's hand moved to the table edge. Not touching him. Just an interruption in the motion. Presence. "Don't," Soren said quietly. "People are looking. People are always looking. This is different." Soren turned his head slightly toward where Torval was standing. He clocked it in under 2 seconds. His jaw set. "I'm aware," he said. Kaler had started to move. A slow, deliberate arc through the room. Not toward Soren's table. Toward the north side. Toward Torval's group. The long way around. Draxon hadn't moved yet. He was still watching Arden. Not with suspicion. With something harder to name. A focused, narrow attention that felt less like threat assessment and more like he was trying to solve something. His nostrils had moved once. Barely visible, barely there. The way an alpha does when a scent crosses their threshold unexpectedly. He had caught something. Arden didn't notice. He was watching the table. Watching his own hands. Trying to decide whether standing up now would be better or worse than staying. "How far along?" Soren asked. The question came out quiet. No ceremony. Like he'd been holding it since he sat down. Arden looked up. 7 months, he said. Soren nodded once. Slowly. His hand was still at the table edge. Not moving. Not retreating. Almost close enough to touch. It was Brecken Torval's voice that broke the room first. Not shouting. Men like that didn't shout in ballrooms. They projected. They calibrated their volume to carry just far enough. Far enough that the people in range would hear but still need to lean in, which meant they were already engaged, already invested, already complicit. Interesting company for a Virex heir, Torval said. He wasn't addressing Soren directly. He was addressing the three men around him like he was sharing an observation. But the silence that fell was not local. It spread. The string quartet didn't stop. The conversations didn't stop. But the texture of the room changed. The way a party changes when something that isn't part of the program gets introduced into it. Heads turned. Not all at once. One, then two, then five. Arden felt it like temperature. He pressed his palm flat against the table. The baby had gone still in the last several minutes, the kind of stillness that comes right before movement like a held breath. He forced his jaw to stay loose. He forced his shoulders down. He would not give Torval the visible reaction. That was the thing Torval was waiting for. Soren hadn't moved. But the quality of his stillness had changed. There is a kind of stillness that is rest. And there is a kind of stillness that is the second before something releases. Soren was in the second kind. Torval spoke again. Still to his circle. Still projecting. Though I suppose when your family is known for its management capabilities, it makes sense to keep certain matters close. The pause before management capabilities was deliberate. Designed. A gap that every person in earshot could fill with their own assumptions, and they did. You could watch them doing it in real time. A ripple of private, comfortable judgment. Arden's vision went a little white at the edges. Not anger. Worse than anger. That particular kind of shame that comes not from what you've done but from what someone else has decided to do with you publicly. In a room where you already felt like you had no right to be standing. He gripped the table edge. His back had been aching since midday. The ache had climbed into something sharper over the last 20 minutes. He hadn't said anything. He wasn't going to. Then Torval turned. This time directly. He looked straight at Arden with the particular expression of a man who has decided to make something a spectacle. Are you quite comfortable? He asked. Pleasant. Smooth as oil. Arden opened his mouth. The floor tilted. Not the literal floor, but that is what it felt like. A sudden drop in pressure. A wave of dizziness that started behind his eyes and moved forward too fast. His hand came off the table. His weight went wrong. He was falling before he knew he was falling. He didn't hit the floor. Soren was standing. He had moved fast. Not the performative fast of someone responding to a camera, but the clean, instinctive fast of someone whose body moved before his decisions caught up. He caught Arden by the arm and the shoulder and held him up in one motion, and the momentum of it pulled them close enough that Arden's face was near his jaw and Soren's chest was solid and immediate and warm. The ballroom froze. Every conversation that had been continuing stopped. The string quartet kept playing for 3 bars before they trailed off one by one until there was only the violinist and then not even that. Arden's breathing was fast and shallow. He pressed his free hand against his stomach. Everything in him was focused on staying vertical. Draxon was moving now. Kaler had reversed direction and was coming back toward the table fast. Brecken Torval had gone quiet. That was important. When men like that go quiet, it means something just happened outside of what they planned for. Arden felt Soren's grip. Both hands. Firm. Steady. Not releasing. He heard Soren say something to someone near them, low and sharp, asking for water, asking for space, asking in the tone of a man who does not ask twice. And then Soren shifted his grip slightly. His arm came around behind Arden's back. And in doing so, his hand landed, for just a second, against the side of Arden's stomach. He didn't pull away. He went completely still. Arden felt it. He looked up. Soren was looking down at his own hand, then up at Arden, then at the hand again. The expression on his face was unlike anything he had worn since they walked into that room. The careful measurement was gone. The controlled presentation was gone. There was something raw underneath. Something that had been startled loose and hadn't found its shape yet. The baby moved. One solid press against the palm. Soren inhaled. Sharp, quiet, private. He leaned in barely, less than an inch, close enough that his voice reached no one but Arden. Why does your scent feel like mine? The door closed behind them like a verdict. Not slammed. Worse than slammed. It closed with the quiet, deliberate click of a room that has decided to hold its secrets in. A side corridor off the ballroom. A service anteroom, white walls, a long table, 2 chairs, fluorescent light that had no opinion about anyone. Soren had moved them here fast. Not grabbing. Guiding. His hand at the small of Arden's back, steady and certain, steering them through a gap in the crowd before the moment could become a scene any further than it already had. A staff member had opened the door. Soren had looked at him once. The man stepped aside and didn't follow. Now it was just the 2 of them. Arden stood near the table. He didn't sit. His back was still aching, but he didn't sit. There was something about sitting in this moment that felt like surrender, and he had already given enough things up in the last 5 years to be careful about what he gave up now. Soren stood near the door, not blocking it, just near it. He looked at Arden the way a man looks at something he has been trying to remember for a long time and has finally found, and isn't sure yet whether finding it is a relief or a complication. Say your name again, Soren said. Arden. The word landed in the room. Soren's eyes closed. 1 second. When they opened, something had shifted. Arden Vale, he said. Not a question. Arden didn't answer. The answer was on his face and they both knew it. Soren moved away from the door. Not toward him, across the room to the far wall, like he needed to put distance between himself and something he couldn't name yet. He stood there with one hand pressed flat against the wall. You left, he said. Yes. Before dawn. Yes. I thought, he stopped. His jaw worked. I thought it was me. That I had done something wrong. That I had misjudged what the night was. Arden felt that in his chest like a physical thing. You didn't, he said. You didn't misjudge anything. Soren turned. Then why? This was the moment. The one Arden had been running from and running toward in equal measure for nearly 5 years. It had a specific weight, this moment. The kind of weight you only understand when you're finally standing inside it. Because I was removed, Arden said. Silence. My contract was killed. My contacts went dark. My lease was terminated by a private management company that wouldn't name their client. He kept his voice flat. Not because he didn't feel it, because feeling it and saying it at the same time was too much to hold. I had a flag in an administrative database. I don't know exactly when it was placed. I know what it did. It made me invisible to anyone who needed to vet a vendor or approve a contract. Soren was very still. I wasn't running from you, Arden said. I was running from whatever had already started moving before I even knew it was moving. Soren crossed the room. He sat down at the table. Not across from Arden but beside him at the adjacent corner, close enough that their voices didn't need to carry. He pulled out his phone. His fingers moved across it with the precision of a man who had learned a long time ago that information was its own form of armor. He found something. Arden watched his face as he read. The expression that came across it was not anger. Not immediately. It was the face of a man encountering something he had never been told about but recognized immediately. The face of someone reading a language they had never studied but somehow already know. These are internal communications, Soren said quietly. From 5 years ago. They were archived in a risk assessment subfolder that I never had reason to access. He turned the phone so Arden could see it. You're named. Your full name. Your contract history. Your residential address. There's a classification marker next to it. Arden looked at the screen. There it was. His name. In a document he had never seen. Inside a system he had never known existed. He read the word next to his name. Managed. Not flagged. Not suspended. Not under review. Managed. Like he was a variable that had been identified and accounted for. Who authorized this? Arden asked. His voice was steady. He needed it to be steady. Soren's thumb scrolled to the bottom of the document. His face changed. Not dramatically. The change was small and specific. The kind of change that happens when something you believed was solid turns out to have a different structure than you thought. Pause on that, the narrator says. Because what Soren saw at the bottom of that document, that matters. The authorization signature. One name. King Eric Virex. His father. Draxen didn't knock. He opened the door and walked in with Kaler one step behind, and the anteroom went from tense to pressurized in the space of a single breath. Draxen looked at his brother, then at Arden, then at the phone in Soren's hand. We need to go, Draxen said. In a minute, Soren said. Not in a minute. Now, Torval has people talking. There are cameras in that ballroom and 2 of them were pointed at the table when Draxen. Soren's voice didn't rise. It just landed. Fully. The way a door closes in a quiet room. Look at this. He held up the phone. Draxen crossed to him in 4 steps. He read. His expression didn't collapse. Draxen's expressions never collapsed. But his jaw tightened, and his head came up slowly, and the look he exchanged with Kaler over Soren's shoulder contained something entire. Kaler took the phone next. He read longer, more carefully. He had that quality, the kind of attention that doesn't skim. He read the classification. He read the action log. He read the authorization. He set the phone down on the table. How long have you known this existed? He asked Arden. I knew something existed, Arden said. I didn't know the details. I didn't know who signed it. Kaler nodded once. Slowly. This is an internal suppression authorization, he said. They're used in cases of significant reputational risk, diplomatic exposure, financial liability. They're supposed to require a full advisory board approval. It doesn't show an advisory board, Soren said. No, Kaler said. It doesn't. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Arden stood near the wall. He had been watching all 3 of them, the way the same information moved through 3 different people who shared a face and didn't share the same way of processing what they were seeing. Draxen was already thinking about consequences. Kaler was already thinking about process. Soren was thinking about Arden. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. We need to go to him, Soren said. Tonight, Draxen said flatly. In the middle of a gala with Torval and his people watching everything. Yes, that is. Tonight, Soren said again. Draxen looked at the ceiling briefly. A gesture that meant he disagreed and had calculated that expressing the disagreement further was not going to change anything. Then we manage the room first, he said. Kaler handles Torval. I'll get to the East Wing without drawing a line. You need 20 minutes. I need longer than 20 minutes. You're getting 20. King Eric Virex was in the East Wing of the Regency, not in the ballroom. He had attended the first hour, visible, cordial, doing what old power does at events like this, making presence felt without making effort visible. Then he had withdrawn to a private suite with 2 advisors and a whiskey that had been waiting for him since noon. He was 63 years old. He had built the Virex institutional legacy across 4 decades of careful maneuvering. He had overseen treaties. He had survived scandals. He had made decisions that affected thousands of people and had carried those decisions without visible weight because visible weight was a luxury that people in his position could not afford. He looked up when Soren walked in, not surprised. Men like Eric Virex were rarely surprised. They had contingencies for contingencies. He looked at his son's face and understood that something had changed. Leave us, he said to the advisors. They left. The room was quiet. You authorized a suppression order, Soren said. 5 years ago, a man named Arden Vale. You had him classified, managed, and removed from every professional network he had without telling me. Eric looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said. Just that. Yes. Soren absorbed it. He was pregnant, Soren said. He was carrying your grandchild, and you erased him. I protected the institution. You protected a reputation. That is the same thing. It is not the same thing. Soren's voice stayed level, but it cost something. You could hear it, the cost of keeping it level when the thing underneath wanted to be something louder. He spent 5 years alone, managing, surviving, raising a child he didn't tell me about because every door I could have walked through to find him had been quietly closed. Eric said nothing. You didn't tell me, Soren said. For 5 years. You would have made a choice that compromised everything we had built. Then that should have been my choice to make. The room held that. Eric Virex set down his glass. He looked at his son. Not with shame exactly, but with the expression of a man who has been carrying the weight of a decision for so long that he has forgotten what it felt like to not carry it. The board will find out, he said. If this surfaces, the advisory process breach alone will. Let it surface, Soren said. And that was the moment the machinery felt something it hadn't felt in a long time. Resistance from inside. Outside the East Wing, on the other side of the estate, Brecken Torval had just finished a phone call. He was smiling, the kind of smile that meant he was already thinking about tomorrow. He didn't know what was already in motion. The charity toast was scheduled for 9:45. Grand ballroom. Full attendance. The kind of moment that these galas built toward. Structured sentiment, raised glasses, the public performance of generosity that powerful people used to remind themselves and each other that they were, at bottom, good. Soren walked back into that ballroom at 9:43. Arden was still in the anteroom. He had asked to stay there. He needed to breathe. He needed the fluorescent light and the white walls and the quiet that didn't require anything from him. Draxon had positioned himself near the east entrance. Kaler was already at the front of the room. Soren moved through the crowd without stopping. People spoke to him. He answered brief, complete, not rude, but moving, always moving, toward the front of the room where the evening's host was adjusting a microphone and checking the order of the toast cards. The host looked up. Soren said something to him, low and direct. The host paused, then nodded and stepped back. Brecken Torval was standing near the second table from the front. He saw Soren move to the microphone. His expression changed, not alarmed, not yet, but recalibrating. Watching. The room settled. Glasses were in hands. The string quartet had gone quiet. The ambient conversation thinned out the way it does when a room senses that something structured is about to happen. Soren stood at the microphone. He didn't have notes. He stood there for just a second, not hesitating, but choosing. The kind of pause that comes before something you have decided on completely. This event raises funds for structural welfare reform, he began. Systems of support for people who fall through gaps that institutions create and fail to acknowledge. That's what tonight is supposed to be about. The room listened. Good. Familiar. Safe. What I want to talk about briefly is what it looks like when an institution creates those gaps deliberately. The temperature in the room changed. Not obviously. The way it changes in a room when someone says something that wasn't on the program. 5 years ago, Soren said, an internal authorization was issued within our advisory structure that resulted in the removal of a private individual from professional networks, housing, and accessible contracts. This authorization was not reviewed by the full advisory board. It bypassed standard process, and it was issued without my knowledge. Torval had gone very still. I am not here to perform outrage, Soren continued. I am here to name it clearly because naming it clearly is the first step in fixing it. Institutions don't reform by pretending the problem was personal. The problem was structural, and structural problems require structural responses. He paused. Short, deliberate, effective immediately, the Virex Advisory Board will undergo an independent compliance audit. Authorization protocols for any action affecting private individuals will require full board consensus and written disclosure. And any individual affected by unauthorized actions taken under our institutional name will have recourse, documented, accessible, enforceable recourse. The room was not silent. It was the kind of not silent that happens when a large group of people are holding their breath, and the sound of that is its own thing. Brecken Torval set his glass down on the nearest table. The move was slow, calculated. The move of a man who just watched his ammunition get disarmed publicly and is already thinking about what else he has. But across the room, near the service door, standing in the partial shadow of the doorframe, Arden had come back. He didn't know why. His feet had just started moving and he had followed them. He stood there, one hand on his stomach, and he watched Soren Virex stand at a microphone in a room full of people who had power he would never have, and dismantle something real. Not for the crowd. The crowd was almost incidental. He did it because the document existed and it bore his father's name, and he had decided, somewhere in that 20-minute conversation in a quiet white room, that he was not going to be the kind of man who knew that and said nothing. Arden's throat tightened. The baby moved. One long, slow roll. Soren finished speaking. He stepped back from the microphone. The host, visibly recalibrating, stepped forward. The room exhaled and refilled itself with noise. Soren turned. He looked, somehow, across that entire room through 200 people, directly at the service door, directly at Arden. He moved, through the crowd, steady, no theater. And when he reached the service door, he stopped in front of Arden and looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something nobody in that ballroom had been prepared for. He went down to one knee. Not in submission, not in performance. The crowd nearest them went quiet in a ripple. First the people right there, then outward like sound traveling in reverse. Soren looked up at Arden. His voice was low, private, but not quiet enough that the people nearest them couldn't hear it. "This child will not be hidden," he said. The suite was on the 4th floor. Soren had asked for it to be cleared, and it had been cleared. He and Arden sat on opposite ends of a low couch in a room that had nothing in it asking anything of either of them. No cameras, no crowd, no microphone, just the aftermath. Arden had his shoes off. His feet were on the edge of the cushion. One hand rested on his stomach. Not anxious now, just present. The baby had settled into a quiet rhythm. Soren sat with his elbows on his knees. He had loosened his collar. His jacket was over the back of the chair across the room. He looked like a man who had just walked through something large and was still accounting for what it had cost him. Neither of them spoke for almost 5 minutes. That was okay. They had learned that about each other 5 years ago on a balcony overlooking dark water. Silence between them wasn't avoidance. It was the place where things got processed before they got said. Soren spoke first. "You didn't trust me," he said. Not accusatory, not angry, just honest in the way that honesty only sounds when the person saying it has accepted their own part in whatever the answer is going to be. Arden looked at the middle of the room. "It wasn't about trust," he said. "Not the way you mean." "Then what?" "I trusted that what happened between us was real." He paused. "Let that sit." "I didn't trust that being real was enough. In the world you live in, the one around you, real isn't always the variable that determines outcomes." Soren was quiet. "I thought I was disposable," Arden said. There it was. The word. Disposable. It landed in the room with more weight than Arden had intended. Or maybe exactly the weight he intended, and he had just never said it out loud before. Either way, saying it now was different from thinking it. Saying it made it into something that existed between two people instead of inside only one. Soren stood up. He moved to the couch. Not the far end. The close end. He sat down near Arden and turned toward him, and his face was doing something that had nothing to do with institutional protocol or advisory boards or anything in a ballroom downstairs. "You were not disposable," he said. "I know that now," Arden said. "Say it like you know it." Arden looked at him. The expression on his face wasn't small. It was large and complicated and honest, and there was grief in it that wasn't gone yet. Grief that had been carried alone for long enough that it had its own shape now, its own weight, its own way of sitting inside a person. "I know that now," he said again, slower, like he was choosing each word and placing it down with care. Soren reached out. His hand found Arden's on the couch. Covered it. Arden didn't pull away. "You should have been able to call me," Soren said. "I should have known. The moment those systems moved. I should have been the kind of person whose door was open enough that you felt like you could reach me." He shook his head. "I wasn't watching what was being done in my name. That's on me. That's not on the institution. That's on me." Arden felt something release in his chest. Not everything. Not all at once. But something. "I was so angry," he said quietly. "For so long. And then the baby came and I didn't have the luxury of being angry anymore. I just had to function." "I know." "You don't, actually." "No," Soren said. "You're right. I don't." That mattered. The fact that he didn't reach past Arden's correction. Didn't soften it. Didn't turn it into something easier for himself. He just received it. Soren moved his hand from Arden's hand to Arden's stomach. He didn't ask. He just moved slowly enough that there was time to stop him. Arden didn't stop him. The warmth of his palm settled there. 1 second. 2. Then a kick. Sharp and sudden and unmistakable. Right under Soren's hand. Soren exhaled. The sound of it was almost silent. A breath that carried more than breath carries. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide that. He just let it be true. "What's the name?" he asked. "I haven't decided," Arden said. "I kept waiting for something to feel right." Soren nodded. "What if I fail you again?" he asked. And that was where all of it lived, in that question. Not in the grand speech. Not in the kneeling. In that question. Small and honest and afraid in exactly the way real things are afraid. Arden looked at him. He thought about the balcony. About the dark water. About the man who had noticed a ramp that wasn't in the floor plan. About the 20 minutes in a white room when 5 years of silence had become something with a shape. "Then we deal with it," Arden said. "Not a guarantee. Not a promise of perfection. Just the truth of two people deciding to try." Soren leaned forward. His forehead came to rest against the side of Arden's head. Gentle. Quiet. The baby moved again, slower this time, settling. "I'm not letting you run this time," Soren said. His voice was low, certain in a way that was not a threat but a fact he had decided to make true. Arden closed his eyes. For the first time in 5 years, he let himself stay. 3 weeks later, the announcement came through official channels. Not from a press release. Not from a managed media rollout. It came from a published compliance report, the first of its kind in Virex institutional history, filed with the Independent Regulatory Council that oversaw advisory governance for families holding public trust designations. 47 pages. It named the authorization. It named the process failure. It named the board restructuring plan. And it named, in the accountability section without softening, the identity of the individual who had issued an unsanctioned suppression order 5 years prior without full board review. King Eric Virex did not contest it. He had 3 sons who had come to him that night and spoken to him in a way he had not been spoken to in decades. Not with rage. With something quieter and harder than rage. With clarity. The kind that comes from people who have decided that love is not the same thing as agreement, and that protecting someone does not mean protecting them from the truth about you. He had listened, and then he had sat in that room alone for a long time. The advisory board was restructured within 10 days. 4 members resigned. 3 new positions were filled with external appointees from governance and civil rights backgrounds. The authorization protocols were rewritten. Any action affecting a private individual now required documented consensus, signed, dated, disclosed. Enforceable. That word mattered more than any speech. Arden moved into a residence on the eastern edge of the palace grounds 2 weeks after the gala. Not the main estate. A smaller property. Private. Surrounded by old trees that had been there longer than anyone currently alive. He wasn't rushed into anything. There were no announcements about him specifically. Not yet, not until he was ready. Soren had been clear about that. The institution would reform publicly. Arden's story was his own, and it would be told on his timeline. That mattered too. On a Tuesday morning that had nothing remarkable about it except the light, which came through the windows at an angle that turned the whole room the color of warm paper, Arden sat on the balcony of the eastern residence and watched the trees. He had a cup of tea that had gone mostly cold. His back didn't ache today. The baby had been active since dawn. Small insistent movements that felt like commentary, like a person already developing opinions about the world from the inside. He heard footsteps behind him. Soren came through the door without knocking. He had stopped knocking 2 weeks ago. Not because he'd been told to, because something between them had shifted into a register where knocking was a formality that didn't fit anymore. He sat down in the chair beside Arden. He looked at the trees. They sat like that for a while. Neither of them in a hurry. Neither of them running. The board filed the public version this morning, Soren said eventually. I saw. How do you feel about it? Arden thought about that honestly. Like something that was wrong got named, he said. Not fixed. Named. Which is where fixing starts. Soren looked at him. There was something in his face that had been there since the gala but was easier to see now, in daylight, without the architecture of an event around it. Something that had nothing to do with responsibility or process or the machinery of institutions. Just him. Just the man on the balcony who had noticed a ramp that wasn't in the floor plan 5 years ago in a different life. He stood up. He moved behind Arden's chair. His hands came to rest. One on each shoulder, light and warm. Then one hand moved forward, slow, until it rested against the curve of Arden's stomach. The baby moved immediately, like recognition. Soren's mouth came close to Arden's ear. This time, he said, the world will know you're mine, not a declaration for the crowd. Not for the cameras or the compliance reports or the restructured board. For Arden, just for him. And outside, the light shifted. The trees moved. And somewhere in a system that had once been designed to erase a person, a new record was being written, one that started not with a classification but with a name. A name that would not be managed. A name that would not be hidden. A name that would be known. That is where the story ends. But if anything in this story stayed with you, the part about being erased by a system instead of a person, the part about running not from heartbreak but from machinery, the part about a man deciding that love is not the same thing as silence. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. There are more stories here. Stories about people who got back up, who refused to disappear, who chose truth when the system wanted quiet. Every single one of them is worth your time. Drop a comment below. What part of this story hit hardest for you? Was it Arden's 5 years alone? Was it Soren choosing to speak when he didn't have to? Was it the moment on the balcony, that first night, or the last one? Tell us. Your words inspire the next person who needs to find this story.